Well, good morning again, everybody. It is the first Sunday in August. It's August 2nd, 2020, and we are gathered again to have another lesson, adult Sunday school lesson, but the book that we're doing still the same, even though we have a new month. The book is still the same. We are in the book of Chronicles. I want to assure you, though, that this time we are actually going to get into the book. I think I kind of promised that last time. We sort of didn't. But I am going to make up for all of your patience by getting us right into chapter 10. So we're going to be in 1 Chronicles chapter 10 today. And I'll give you a little while to find that in your own Bible if you prefer. But if you would rather have me do that for you, or read it to you, I am going to pull this up on a website that if you don't already know about it, you really should. This is BibleGateway.com. It's free, and there is so much on here. For one thing, you can look up any, not just passage, but if you know a word or a phrase and you just want to know what's the address in the Bible where it is, you can look here. And the other neat thing is any translation, pretty much, in multiple languages, is available to you right here. So all this for free, plus there's commentaries, there's other material on here. I can't rave about this enough because I think I've used this, oh gosh, pretty much every day for I don't know how many years, but I use it for school, I use it for my own Bible study, and if you have an interest in learning more, go out and check it out yourself. There's a lot here, and like I said, most everything that you would probably ever want is here for free, so check it out. Okay, so now everyone should be in their Bibles. We're in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, and as you can see here, I'm reading today from the New King James Version. We are going to be jumping ahead of the first 9 chapters, which are all the genealogies that we've been talking about, and we're now going to be talking about Saul and his tragic end, as it says here. The editor put that in there. Okay, let's go ahead and read that. There we go. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and fell slain upon Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, that must be it, Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died. So Saul and his 3 sons died, and all his house died together. And when all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that they had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook their cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So it happened the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they stripped him and took his head and his armor, and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of their gods, and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon. And when all Jabesh Gilead heard all that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons, and they brought them to Jabesh, and buried their bones under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and also because he consulted a medium for guidance. But he did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he, God, killed him, and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. Okay, well, what's interesting here, that this account pretty much follows what we read about Saul in 1 Samuel. And you can go back and read 1 Samuel. That's where you're going to find most of your information about Saul. But isn't it interesting that the chronicler leaves out so much about Saul that we learn from other places? He leaves out how Saul was chosen to be Israel's first king. He leaves out Saul's beginnings, which seemed like they were pretty good, and some of his successes in battle. He was very close to the prophet Samuel, because Samuel was the one who had anointed him king. And Samuel actually liked Saul very much and was quite disappointed in him. And that just grew and grew over time. But in Chronicles, we don't read any of that. We don't read about Samuel. We don't read about how Saul was disobedient and he was told to destroy all the Amalekites, and he spared the king, Agag, which, by the way, caused no end of trouble later on. He was disobedient in a number of ways. And another thing that was very interesting is that he ended up being very jealous of David. David was a servant of his, basically. He was one of his soldiers. He played harp for him when he was unhappy and he had a distressed spirit come upon him. David played the harp to soothe him. But he became very jealous of David because David had a lot of military success. And I wonder why that was. Maybe because David always asked God to help him, and Saul was kind of hit or miss about that. The only thing that the chronicler points to is the consulting of the medium, which you can read about that in 1 Samuel as well. But it's interesting to me that we don't learn anything much more about Saul just from Chronicles, except that he was unfaithful. And that gets, I think, at a lot more of what the book of Chronicles is about. They're not as concerned the author of Chronicles is not as concerned about all of the, I don't know, just sort of battles and this and that happened. It was, what was this person's relationship with God? And for the chronicler, the most important thing was that Saul's relationship with God in the final analysis was not very good. And he consulted a medium, which if you've read Leviticus, you know that's a definite no-no. You do not mess with the occult. The Bible's very clear about that. Well, Saul, I guess, got tired of waiting for God, and that isn't the first time he got tired of waiting for God. Basically, Samuel had already warned him that God was going to rip the kingdom out of his hands, and it took several times before Saul actually believed that. But ultimately, it was unfaithfulness that caused Saul's demise. From here on, we're going to start seeing David, who will be Israel's second and greatest king, his career and how that unfolds. We don't need to know a lot about Saul, according to the chronicler, because he was kind of, I don't know. In the chronicler's view, he didn't matter all that much, which is kind of interesting, because I don't think that the uh, the the reputation of Saul in Jewish history is as poor as you would have it be if you were just reading Chronicles. And the reason I say that is because Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and by the way, he was promised the kingdom forever if he obeyed God. Early on in his rule, he was told that his sons would rule forever, just like David was told, if he remained faithful. And of course, he didn't remain faithful, so it was a moot point. But I sometimes wonder how all of history would have been different if he had remained faithful and the Benjaminites had remained the ruling family. But it isn't how it turned out. The Judahites did, and as we probably know, David was just the first in a long line of Jewish or Judahite kings. And who do we call the Lion of the tribe of Judah but Jesus Christ himself, who was a descendant of Judah? Now, it's not beyond God to have had Jesus descend from Benjamin, but that's, like I say, it's a moot point because that is not what happened. But here's what I think is interesting. If Saul had a bad reputation, the way, let's say Benedict Arnold did in the American Revolution, he was a very competent general. He was probably the best general that they had on the American side, and maybe on the British side as well. But he was passed over for promotion, and he became annoyed, and he became a traitor. Well, after that, the name Benedict, which, by the way, beforehand had been often given to sons, was no longer given to sons, and almost dead stop. And you kind of wonder about Adolf. I don't know, but I wonder if in Germany there are a lot of young kids called Adolf anymore after what happened with Mr. Hitler in the Second World War. But the interesting thing is that it didn't seem to matter that much to the Jews that Saul was disgraced. I'm basing that on another Benjaminite who came along many centuries later. His Hebrew name was Saul, though we know him better as Paul. That's his Greek name, the Apostle Paul, who never seemed ashamed at all that his parents had named him after that first very unsuccessful king. So you just never know. But now that we have plunged into the beginning of the narrative part of Chronicles, I think you can see where this is headed. We're going to start looking at kings and their relationships with God. So in coming weeks, we probably won't look at every single one, but I'm going to hit on some of the highlights so you get the idea of what this book is trying to say, what its message is for the Jewish people. And in the meantime, I encourage you again to be reading Chronicles. Just keep right on going now. You can start in chapter 10 if you want to. If you haven't already finished those 9 chapters of genealogy, then, you might as well wait and see how much I end up referring to them over time. But let's go ahead and get on with the rest of our day. Thanks so much for being here with me. You have a blessed Sunday and a blessed rest of your week, and I will see you again next Sunday.